When you say killer, do you mean literally?
Literally killer. I mean, you look, suicide rates, you look at the mental health crisis, there's a fundamental reason people are upset. They are struggling. People are struggling. This concept of printing money to create, let's say, artificial value, asset value, trickles up, but the person at the shop's trying to buy food, they were the ones who suffered through COVID and continue to suffer as a result of COVID.
Philip, I know we've asked you this plenty of times, but is there a better way of running business? Is there a better way of running society?
Of course there is. And we have to give people a voice, and we have to give nature a voice. But the starting point is we have to limit the supply of money.
The Manna journey is the catalyst for change in our world. It's a consistent source of truth for the next generation and current leaders. Our mission is to change the world by reframing our current governance, by using ancient wisdom to solve modern problems, and by shaping innovative new businesses to have a culture of pursuit of purpose.
I just want to quickly ask you about inflation. How damaging is inflation to people?
It's the single largest killer. I mean, the opposite, I think it was...
When you say killer, do you mean literally?
Literally killer. I mean, you look, suicide rates, you look at the mental health crisis, there's a fundamental reason people are upset. They are struggling. People are struggling. And you have people that are even considered wealthy, that have good jobs. They have, their partner also has to work this day and age. Their partner or themselves may have 2 or 3 jobs, even though on paper you would look and say, this is a very successful person. They're not. They can't afford basic things anymore. And it goes back to inflation is what has driven costs of everything up. And so your take-home income is a fraction of what you can buy a fraction of what you could have bought a generation ago.
Philip made the point on one of the previous shows, and it happened to give the example of a cucumber, though it doesn't matter what particular example you give, that if there is inflation of 25%, and that's on both property and a cucumber, if I don't own a property, then I'm effectively subsidising the rich, because I have to pay extra for my cucumber in order for you to have a 25% more valuable house.
Yes, it essentially is, because the funds that are being printed out of commercial banks and government and central banks is not flowing down to the person who's buying the cucumber. It's getting stuck into asset prices. And we saw that through COVID, right? They printed so much money that actually what happened, asset prices rebounded, and the NASDAQ in a short space of time was higher than it was pre-COVID, despite there being a very serious recession and impact and a huge increase in suicides and everything else, and domestic abuse at home for working people. The stock market in a short space of time was higher than it was pre-COVID. So this concept of printing money to create, let's say, artificial value, asset value, trickles up, but the person at the shop's trying to buy food, they were the ones who suffered through COVID and continue to suffer as a result of COVID and the policies, economic policies.
Philip, I know we've asked you this plenty of times, but is there a better way of running business? Is there a better way of running society? Is there, dare I say, a better way of running banking?
Of course there is. And we have to give people a voice, and we have to give nature a voice. But the starting point is we have to limit the supply of money. Not to a gold standard, because gold standard is a commodity.
So literally say to banks and governments, there will be no more crazy printing.
It's part of the bank concept, because in the end, in this model, I see no role for banks.
Right.
That would be straight.
Why not?
Because they are private organisations dealing with social issues. They're motivated by greed, and therefore to give a particular set of private organisations the right to determine how society works. It's crazy. You can't do it.
I mean, I must admit, Philip, I pull out my phone and I've got more options for more banks, for more banking services than ever before. I can trade crypto, I can trade a currency, I can get loans, I can do everything. But the more that banking seems to expand, the more that seems to correlate with a greater degree of poverty and a lower level of home ownership.
Because banks literally have a license to print money. They create money for their own interest and the interests of the wealthy. As long as that is the model, we're never going to resolve the problems we've got within society. It's not going to happen.
And banks are giving liabilities out to people. So when you get a loan, it's a liability, it's a burden, which is why, I mean, you know, Medici, the first bank, when they started, I mean, they were exiled. They were considered the lowest of the low to be lenders, and usury, you know, lending at unfair rates was banned, and it was banned pretty much by every religion and every sort of the nobles and everything else. It was a curse until eventually the Medici family and bank got enough power and leverage, you know, with the institutions, with the people, you know, by donations, that they sort of built up, that they became too difficult to get rid of. And it started from them.
But banking now goes into all of our lives, and we sometimes feel that we serve the banks. But I'm really interested just on your background for a second, because obviously regular viewers and listeners to this show know about Phillip and know about his journey. But how easy is it for somebody like you, who's in business every single day, working with some of the biggest names in business, and also some of the most important family offices, that means wealthy people, how easy is it for you to hold views that are quite counter to the way the economy works at the moment?
I think it's essential. I think it's the only way you can thrive and succeed, is you have to be counterintuitive, almost counterlogical, because the vast majority, the path that we are told by society, by our parents, you know, was, you know, get a job, go to work, have a 9 to 5, and raise your kids and go through this process. But when I started I didn't start working for these ultra high net worth individuals. I had to prove myself, and I had to create success where others couldn't. And it started, I was in a corporate job, and I was working and working, you know, 12, 15-hour days, and I was, you know, running on the treadmill and going. And I was looking, and I said, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. You know, it was a fantastic organization, but I wasn't succeeding. You know, I didn't have that much time to myself. The amount of money I'd made, you had to overspend to compensate. And so you were just on this treadmill. And I looked at this quite early, thankfully, in my career, and said, this doesn't work. This doesn't work for me. And it doesn't even work economically for me. And it doesn't work from a holistic lifestyle for me. And so I left that, and long story short, started solving very complex problems.
Can I ask you a question? And it's a question that comes up on the Manna journey on a regular basis. Were you effectively a slave to a system that wasn't working for you? Because we talk about slavery so often on this show, and Phillip brings it up, this idea that you're on the treadmill, you are forced into a system, you're not doing a job you enjoy, you're not bringing back the money that you want, you never see your family, you don't make decisions over your own life, you're a slave to a bank because of your mortgage. Has many of the facets of slavery, doesn't it?
It does, with the exception that you're a slave in your own head. I think it's a mindset that if you start questioning your own position, questioning society, saying, is there a better way to do something? Whatever it may be, your job, your purpose, your family life, is there another way to do this? Is there a better way to do it? Then you start finding solutions and saying, well, wait a minute, maybe I don't need to be a slave.
But hang on a second, Andrew, and I'll bring Phillip in now. That's fine for you, but Phillip, harder for somebody in a warehouse.
I employ more than 100,000 people a year. They have no choice. You're fortunate and privileged, as indeed many of us are. But the average worker, we won on the show where somebody phoned me, if you remember, and said he was living off £5,000 a year. Yes. He has no scope to not become a slave. Working in a warehouse when you're doing 18, 19 miles of walking in a shift for a minimum wage, you have no choice. You are a slave, whether you like it or not. If you're even an immigrant who's come from Eastern Europe to work in a warehouse, you haven't brought your family with you because you can't afford to support your family.
Is there a tendency amongst people like us who perhaps have gone to university, perhaps have come from more affluent background, and perhaps will like to think of ourselves a bit more intelligent? Is there a tendency amongst us to dismiss the fact that we have more opportunities than the average Joe working in an ordinary job?
Yeah, it's very difficult to think about the way someone else views the world, but we have to, and nobody is doing it for these people. So the vast majority of slaves, they are slaves. They can't do work which is meaningful, which we can consider. They can't have a secure home. They can't have build a family because they can't afford to build a home. They can't be part of a community. This is slavery. And we live in a time of huge amounts of slavery.
And this is a global, this is a global matter.
Hang on, people tend to think it's only Britain that has this problem.
It's not, because a lot of the work I've done has been in emerging markets where, in some cases people, domestic workers and stuff wouldn't even work for money. They would just be given shelter and some food, and that is literally slavery. And they're stuck in that system because there's nothing else they can do. And so in the West, it doesn't look as much like slavery, but I agree, you're stuck in this situation
We also don't look at the wider issue, do we? Because when you look at somebody, say, running around a warehouse, an older person will be slower than a younger person, but we forget that when we have all these performance targets, when we have meaningless jobs, when we have repetitive jobs, the social security has to step in when people get made redundant. Perhaps we have to pay for housing benefits. And actually, it might well be that if we weren't so profit motivated, we'd make more money. And the reason I make that point is because sticking somebody on the scrap heap is probably less viable for a society than allowing them to go at their own pace.
It is, but until there's structural change at a government level and a government policy level, it's very difficult for private enterprise to achieve that by itself. Yes. I think, because what you want is a trickle-down effect where that those policies work and that goes down to people who need it the most. But if you're in a country where it's very expensive to live, so, cost of your supermarket and your cucumber is more than you can afford. If your taxes are extremely high, and if your cost of living, just transportation, infrastructure, basic goods, heating here in the UK, if that stuff is prohibitively high, it's very difficult to break out of that cycle. And I think so it has to be a combination of both the private sector and the public sector.
Well, Philip, it's fair to say that that's precisely the point that you've made, that you started as making wire in Watford, then went into outsourcing, and now you're campaigning for a radical change. You think that the government can start making changes at some point when the system collapses? Now, you and I have had this argument before. I say the system is already collapsing. You say it will collapse, but it doesn't matter, does it?
Look, of course it's collapsing, but to trigger the kind of systemic change that Andrew and I are both talking about requires something more extreme. It's not going to be an incremental change. You have to have an event which triggers a change of mindset, because otherwise the powers that be are not going to change. And it's not happening. We're seeing social unrest in America, we're seeing it here, and it's getting bigger. The riots that we saw here are big. What's happening in America, what happened with after the election was out last time, was big. This week, we could be talking about something similar. So the degree of social unrest is growing. And I'm not arguing with you, the system is collapsing, but you need a catastrophic failure to trigger the kind of change of mindset that we're talking about.